Hello, let's talk about risk-based scope review, and specifically let's talk about risk-based scope review using the Nova J-Factor tool. So I'm going to do two videos to talk about the J-Factor tool. First, we're going to just talk about why we want to use the tool and what specifically the tool does. And then I'll do a more comprehensive video where we walk through the process of using the tool so that everybody can understand exactly what it takes to evaluate scope using this tool, and at the end of which we hope that everybody understands not just how to use the tool to evaluate scope, but what we've gained by using this tool to evaluate scope. So, to start with, the J-Factor is basically a cost-benefit analysis tool. And as you'll see when we walk through this in bigger detail, we're not necessarily going to apply the J-Factor to all of our scope. Some of our scope we do consider to be automatic acceptance. We'll talk about that a little bit further down the road. So what J is going to equal, justification factor, is going to equal the unmitigated risk cost and probability minus the mitigated risk cost and probability divided by the cost of mitigation. And by mitigation, we actually literally mean doing the work. If we do the work, I mean, the presumption is you can never really change a consequence in terms of the severity. If the severity of the consequence is X, it'll always remain X. What you can influence, though, by doing a work, and what turnaround work and most outage work seeks to do, is to mitigate the probability of the risk. So you see that in our explanations. Unmitigated risk is probability if unmitigated. Mitigated risk is probability if mitigated. So there is an assumption that when we take this piece of scope and maybe we take this vessel down, we go inside, we do all of this inspection scope, the assumption is that when we come back online, the probability of any number of failures taking place in that piece of equipment is now been reduced by our having completed this. So that's the overall turnaround type philosophy. So we have an example that'll show us J factor equals 10 is a very significant number for us. So let's look at how we get that. If we had a consequence with a likely $1 million cost attached to it, and the unmitigated probability of that was 10%. And if we complete the work scope that's being proposed, the risk assessment is that the probability will now perhaps only be 1%. And the cost to repair this particular thing, to complete this particular line of scope, would be $9,000. So if we put that into the formula we just talked about, this exact example would give us a J equals 10, a J factor of 10. And J factor equals 10 is a significant number that we're going to talk about further on down the road. So let's take a look at the risk assessment matrix that will be central to the work that we're going to be doing using this tool. And it is very important that people that sit on evaluation teams that are risk matrix based need to be very much paying attention to the exact risk matrix that they were asked to use. So this is the one that is currently attached to the J-Factor tool. And this works like any PSM matrix you ever seen. Down the side, in the column down the side, we have severity of consequences, and across the top we have likelihood of that consequence coming by. This is a fairly strict matrix. I will say that's just my personal input. We've really brought the bar down on the work that we're going to later on be calling automatic work. So work that maybe formerly might have had some debate about it is now, for safety and other reasons, being brought strictly in. So if there was going to be a major change in how this tool worked, it would be a change based on changing this matrix, because this is the central matrix. So everybody that's going to be tapped to sit in a J-Factor quorum needs to spend a little bit of time making sure they are familiar with this matrix, because this is the matrix you will be evaluating your scope based on. So now, and this will make way more sense when I go through it with the tool, but this is just how simple a J-factor review is if you just look at it in steps. Can this work be done online? That's the very first question you're going to be asked. We'll look at that when we're looking at the tool. If the answer is yes, then we are done with this scope item. It is out of scope now. It can be done online. The very next question that you're going to be asked sitting in this review is this regulatory scope? So it is NOVA practice currently that if it's regulatory scope, it is automatically in scope. Now I'm going to show you when we go over the tool itself, there is an interrelation between these two questions too that we'll take a look at when we're looking at it in detail. All of the rest of the J-factor spreadsheet for scope items that test yes on either of these, we can leave to fill that out later. We don't need to complete these line items. We get our answer immediately. If both of these first two questions answer no, then we're going to proceed down through the sheet. So we want to start with a brief, a few words explaining what would happen if this proposed work wasn't done and a failure took place. Are we talking about a loss of containment? Are we talking about a 25% curtailment in production? Are we talking about a constant drip of contaminated condensate onto the ground in some kind of an ongoing environmental issue? Those are the kinds of questions we want to, in a few words, just answer into that question. Then we're going to use our risk matrix, and we're going to use the left side of the risk matrix, and we're going to find where the team, not an individual, where the quorum that is sitting here to evaluate, where do we feel this sits in an S1 to S6 likelihood. That's going to give us a severity. And then we're going to write in a consequence. Now, if we have a pretty good idea how much money that's going to cost, that would be the preferred answer. Okay, but maybe we don't know. Maybe we don't know how much money it's going to cost, so we're going to say we're going to lose a shift of production. Or maybe we're going to say there's a potential to create several lost time accidents, something like that, and we're just going to put it in words, just so that we have something locked down there. Then we're going to go across the top of our matrix, and we're going to, as a quorum, decide what the likelihood of this happening before the next opportunity to do work. So if this particular turnaround is on a 4-year cycle, if we don't do this work now, what's the likelihood of the failure taking place in the next 4-year run cycle? And that'll give us a number on our L1 to L6. The next thing we want to know is if we do the work, what will our probability factor be then? And this is kind of a key question when it comes to turnaround work, because if we spend $500,000 doing some amount of work on some piece of equipment, and the probability of $1 million failure is exactly the same as before we did the work, there's some question as to whether we're even doing the right work in the first place in that case. Usually we would expect that we'll come into it with like an L3 likelihood, we'll complete the turnaround on that piece of equipment, and that'll give us, for the next 4 years, an L1 probability, and that becomes our gain. So once we have worked our way through the whole tool, and again, we don't have to catch it all here. I'm going to go through the tool in detail in the part 2 video. But once we have completed all of the J-factor for all of our lines of scope, we will have effectively sorted our scope into these buckets. The question 1 bucket will have yielded work that we're just going to say is out of scope. That is a very black and white commitment from the organization that if work can be done while the facility's online reasonably, then that's when it's going to be done. So that work is out of scope. It is a NOVA policy that regulatory work will be done. And that, quite frankly, is pretty much a North American-wide policy these days. So that work would be in scope. Then we have by completing the J-factor review, we have sorted the rest of our scope into scope that the matrix tells us is a AA risk, scope that the matrix tells us is an A risk. And you will see when we're working the tool that we kind of group those two things together in terms of how we look at them and how we're going to evaluate them. Then we have another bucket where we have scope, which has a J factor greater than 10. And that would usually then be a trigger to be on the scope list. And then we have the remaining scope, which has a J factor of less than 10. And some of the scope that's going to come in that bucket is going to present some of the biggest challenges for the team, because it's work that the tool is telling us we should not be doing, and yet it might have all kinds of hair hanging off it or people's passions attached to it. So what we're trying to do by using a tool like this is remove all of those things. If the tool is telling us that the J factor for this is 3.2, then our commitment to the tool is such that that work is in all likelihood not going to get done. I don't want to speak in absolutes. It's never a safe thing to speak in absolutes, but for the most part, the intention of using the J-factor tool is if the tool says it's in, and if the tool says it's out, it's out. And there are some flexibilities and adjustments there that we'll talk about when we go through the tool in detail. So this is the basic process that we're going to just talk about briefly so that everybody's aware of it. We need to start scheduling the meetings for the big J-factor review. So there's going to be more than one J-factor review involved in this thing going forward. There's going to be a big facilitated review on the bulk of scope that was submitted prior to scope freeze. That will be a facilitated J-factor review, which will involve the COE, and it's going to lay out something like this. We're going to have the following people are going to be involved. The event manager is going to be involved. The turnaround team is going to be involved. The planners are going to be involved. The ULT/steering team is going to be involved. Discipline engineers need to be involved, and the RR focal, risk ranking focal, in this case will most likely be somebody from the COE. That is the quorum who is going to process, all these hundreds of line items of scope the first time through. We will then also need an in-house version of this quorum made up out of the turnaround team and the steering team for the particular unit which the turnaround that we're talking about is for. And it will need to mirror this in terms of disciplines that are at the table and authorities that are at the table. And teams are well advised that several people on the team should be fully comfortable with running the J-factor tool for the, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the tool, when we get into the part 2 video. So 16 months out, T-16, that's when you should set up these meetings. It's going to, in general, the expectation is it will take 3 days to push your bulk scope through the J-factor process. So that's what we're looking at, and you could look at it as doing smaller teams trying to push the whole volume of scope through in one day through 3 separate teams, or you could look at it as a big event, 3 days long, everybody in the room at the same time, 3 days to push through the entire volume of scope. Either way, it needs to be scheduled well in advance. It needs to be scheduled such that we will complete this first J-factor review in the T-14 to T-12. At T-12, we are going to go into scope freeze. We will have now our bulk scope list, and we will have another process for bringing new scope in through our added work scope control process, which will now also be subject to J-factor review. So that's the gist of where we're going with this, and the reason why the company is choosing to go down this road. In the second part of this video series, I'll walk through exactly what it looks like to do a J-factor review, and I think it's probably not as intimidating when you really get down to it as people might think. Admittedly, this first one with 4,000 or 5,000 scope items to review is a pretty big task. But when you're talking about added work and later on down the road found work, those are coming in at smaller volumes, and the undertaking becomes significantly less. So I'll see you back here for the part 2, and thank you for your time.